Okay, so we're going to do the Camera Raw lecture. This is Lab 8. You can find that folder inside of the public server under Lab Materials for DIGM 2350. Let's get started. Okay, so the first thing, I don't want to get too much into photography itself. It's more about the software, but I do need to talk a little bit about Camera Raw itself. Camera Raw is a setting that most higher-end cameras, now not so much the point-and-shoots, although some point-and-shoots can, it's a setting that you can save as. And so instead of saving as a JPEG, you can save it as a Camera Raw. And these Camera Raw is actually a group of formats. It's not just one format. This is .dng. There's also CR2, which is Canon's RAW format. .nef, which is Nikon's format, and then each proprietary camera has its own, or each camera has its own proprietary version of Camera Raw. So the downside to shooting Camera Raw is that you have a file that you can't use anywhere, really. You have to open it. You have to edit it. You have to look at it. You have to export it in some way. So you have to go to a computer. A JPEG you can just throw right up on Flickr, throw right up on Facebook, but it has compression and it's also been edited, at least by your camera. Those JPEGs get a little bit of settings applied to them. Camera Raw is exactly what your camera took. And one thing that I've done here is I've exported these. I originally shot them with a Canon camera, but I've exported these as the .dng format, which is Adobe's native Camera Raw format. There's a converter that you can download for free off Adobe's website, and I highly recommend that once you shoot in Camera Raw, you go ahead and immediately convert those to .dng. There is no downside to converting to DNG, and it'll save you about 20%, depending on the RAW format, of your hard drive space. So they're smaller. Also, Adobe has guaranteed that they'll always support the .dng format. So it's a nice archival format, and you can store them and save a little bit of space. Now, whenever you're saving, now we're going to apply settings to these Camera Raws, and it applies it kind of like a layer in Photoshop. You always have the original file underneath, so it's essentially just applying settings on top of it. You can imagine having a piece of paper and then just kind of applying another piece of transparent paper on top of it, like your settings. Whenever you apply these settings in Camera Raw, it will generate one of these .xmp files. Those are the settings themselves. So if you transfer your Camera Raw files, you also need to bring along this .xmp file, because those are the settings. Without it, you won't have all of the settings that we created inside of Camera Raw. Now, I think that .dng files might embed the XMP files with them. I can't quite remember. So the .dng files might natively store that information, but all of the other formats, I don't think they do. Okay, so back to Bridge. Let's select one of these photos. Is anybody, let's see, what photo should we edit? Let's go ahead and edit this one. Yeah, this will be a good one for now. So navigate, find file 2426, IMG 2426, and double click it. It should open up in Camera Raw, if you recall last time. So Camera Raw is a plugin that can run on top of other software. Now, by default, it will run as a plugin inside of Photoshop. So if you weren't here last week, or if you didn't change that setting inside of Bridge, you can go to Preferences, and I think it's double-click Edits Camera Raw inside of Bridge, which is kind of just a nice setting, because if you didn't change that, then it would be loading Photoshop right now. So the first thing I need to talk about is the histogram inside of Camera Raw. The histogram is simply a bar chart. That's all it is. It's just a bar chart that includes the darkest parts of my image off to the left side and the brightest parts of my image on the right side. And it's there's 256 of these bars, so there's a lot of them. And as you can see on the board here, I've got a 0, 1/4 tones, and then we usually have a half tones, 3/4 tones, and then our blacks. And usually in a range from 0 to 255. Well, wait, didn't I say 256? Anybody know why it's not 256? Because 0 is a value, yeah. So 256 levels. That is to say that there's 256 colors per channel, or rather 256 shades of gray per channel, which gives us 16.7 million colors when you combine all three channels. Anyway, okay, so let's take a look at this left-hand side on the screen, which is our temperature and tint and things like that. Let's skip our temperature and tint. I'm going to cover more about that when we cover the tools in just a second. And so right now we have a fairly dark image, and we kind of see a lot of those dark pixels. Our bar chart is highest towards our darker pixels. And then we have some pixels kind of in the mid-ranges and things like that. Now, the histogram doesn't really give us, it gives us kind of general ideas of what's going on in our photo. It doesn't give us a lot of specifics. It's not something that I'm really going to look at, like, you know, level 240 or something and look at that highlight and say, well, this is too bright. I'm not going to look at that. It's just a general overview of what's going on. So under this basic tab, and there's a bunch of tabs here at the top, we have a couple of things. We'll start with the first one, which is the main one, and we have a bunch of settings here. So usually when I'm editing, I start with auto, which is to say that auto doesn't do a very good job by itself, but it does kind of set things initially for me. It does a pretty good job in this photo, but especially people, what it's trying to do is create sort of a bell chart or a bell graph out of the histogram, and it's not always going to, it's got some other concerns and things like that, but it's not always going to do the best job. It does okay with this one. I think it brightens a little bit too much. It's not really considering the fact that, oh, I have a photo of a sunset. It's not really thinking in terms of that. It's just looking at color values and technical things. So I usually start with auto, and then I kind of tweak it as needed. Let's get into exposure, contrast, highlights, shadows, and whites and blacks. I'm not going to cover these in a huge amount of detail because, frankly, there's only one way to learn them, and that is to use them a lot in different settings and just taking a photo and just taking that exposure all the way up and just seeing what happens. Exposure is kind of like thinking in terms of brightness. It will function the same way that exposure works inside of your camera. So if you underexposed by a stop, you can simply correct that by overexposing or setting a value of 1 for our exposure. It really just kind of brightens the whole photo. Who here knows what contrast is? What is contrast literally? Does anyone take a guess? Yeah. How it differs? How what differs? The colors? Well, maybe not. It can in graphic design, but not in terms of photography. Hmm? It's. Yeah, I mean, it's how. Yes, it has to do with the light. That's close. So, what contrast is? Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Well, I just noticed when I'm moving, like the contrast this way, it pushes in all the colors.
Yeah. So it pushes them in.
Yeah.
Are you increasing contrast or decreasing contrast?
Decreasing.
So by decreasing contrast, so if we're taking away contrast, it's going to push. It's going to pull everything in. What is that in terms of the histogram? If we shrink our histogram, what are we doing? Not color. Histogram is usually brightness and contrast. You can kind of see color, but I mean, you can kind of see the RGB channels in here. It's showing you red and green and blue. Okay, well, let me ask you another question. I'm going to draw a chart here. Here's one chart. And let's say another chart like so. So kind of like a bell chart and then a valley. What is going on inside of this photo? I have a lot of
extreme lights and extreme dark.
yes, which is also a lot of contrast. In this photo, I have the opposite. I have a lot of my tones are centered towards the middle. So therefore, contrast is taking your brights and making them brighter, if you increase it, and taking your darks and making them darker. It's doing this to your brights and shadows. So wherever that 50% mark, so halfway in the middle of this histogram, it's going to take your brights, and we can see that when I do it. It pushes the middle out. Makes my brights brighter and my darks darker. Likewise, when I subtract it, I get more of, it shrinks everything in. So that's contrast. Let's go back to auto. Highlights are primarily concerned with the top part of that histogram. Somewhere around the 1/4 tones, a little bit darker than that, and brighter. So you'll notice that as I take the highlights, and incidentally, where are the highlights in this image, if you guys had to guess? What's the highlights?
Sun.
The sunshine and
Sky.
the sky, yes. The sky is probably, now I don't know for sure, but we can see here in our histograms, our blues are right up here. That's probably our sky. So if I take my highlights up and we see what our histogram does, it kind of pushes, it brightens, it creates more, it takes the highlights and makes them brighter. I can also decrease them. Oh, oops, I have my warnings on. We'll talk about that in a second. I turned that warning off. That's why we were seeing red right there in the middle. Shadows is the opposite of highlights. It's like just like highlights, but on the other side. So as we increase and decrease the shadows, we can see here I'm not affecting the sky whatsoever. I'm only affecting the shadow areas. Whites and blacks are very similar to highlights, except they're even more extreme. Our whites tends to deal with only the brightest parts of the image, and the blacks only tend to deal with the darkest parts of the image. And a lot of this is going to take just an enormous amount of practice. Usually our brights are too bright and we want to bring them down, and our shadows are too dark and we want to bring them back up. And we can see that that's kind of happening here. If I hit auto, it takes my shadows up quite a bit. Now, one of the things to watch out for, to understand, and let me kind of create a little bit of an extreme here. Turn my warnings on so I know what's going on. Let me zoom in on the histogram so you guys can see. Okay, so what's going on with this photo? I have a lot of pure black, and I have a lot of, well, some really brights, and then pure white as well. In photography, you want a little bit of pure black, and you want a little bit of pure white, but these are called, it's called blowing out the highlights. But wherever you have pure white, there is no detail. There's nothing there but just white. That's it. So essentially there's kind of like nothing. So if you take your detail and you push it all the way up, there's not going to be anything there. And likewise with the shadows. If I create too many shadows, then I'm going to make it really dark, and there's not going to be any detail there. In this instance, let me zoom back out. I'm destroying all my clouds and a lot of the area, especially around here. And I'm also probably darkening the trees in here. So right around here in this part of the photo, I have no leaves. There's nothing there. Let me bring this back to audio. Well, actually, so what we do is we have warning dialog box, and you can turn these on and off. They're a little bit annoying. The hotkeys are I and the letter U's on your keyboard. And these will tell us, oh, I'm blowing out the red channel, or oh, the blue channel is getting too dark, which is really just to say I wouldn't worry about the colors themselves, but I've created too much. Another way of looking at this is if you hold down the Alt key, because Adobe loves the modifier keys on your keyboard. Those are the Alt, Option, Command, and Shift keys. If I hold those down and then start to move one of these sliders, I will get those warnings as well. So just kind of a different way to see that. I actually kind of like this way a little bit better. Sometimes if I'm working with a lot, it depends on what I'm working on, but these get pretty annoying. If I do use them, I end up turning them on and off constantly. I'll hit auto to kind of bring us back to normal. Okay, so that's kind of a brief overview of those. Again, just using them is going to really be the way to learn them. Understanding them conceptually is kind of, yeah, you'll sort of get it, but you have to really experience like every kind of photo out there before you start to see that. Let's talk about the next three dialog boxes. Clarity. I'm going to go ahead and take up my exposure and brighten the photo some. Maybe blocks down. Clarity looks kind of like sharpening. I'm going to zoom in here. I press the Z key for the zoom tool, and then I'm going to select an area to zoom in. And as I increase my clarity, it sort of makes the image look sharper. It also typically makes it look a little bit more grungy. You can also decrease clarity as well, although I usually don't find much use in that. What clarity is that it is edge contrast. We're going to talk about more what that is next week. But the thing that you should never, ever do is apply a lot of clarity to a person, or a photo of a person, I mean. This will make them look like a zombie. So if you like this person, don't do it, I should say. So if you like this person, don't apply a lot of clarity. It makes it just, every detail of their face will become apparent very quickly. Not something you necessarily want. So I'll bring that back to 0. For this photo, it kind of works okay, so maybe a little bit. Vibrance and saturation. I think most of us understand what saturation is. It's taking the colors, kind of making them more pure. So as I increase this, my blues become bluer, my yellows become yellower, and I've got the warnings on, so I'll turn those off. I can also decrease saturation and make it black and white. Vibrance, on the other hand, is almost just like saturation, except that it does it a little bit more intelligently. So saturation is a hammer. It's like, I will saturate this image no matter what. And vibrance is a little bit more soft-handed. It's not going to blow out. It's going to protect things like skin tones. It's not going to hypersaturate some of the colors that you don't want to saturate. And you can actually kind of create some neat effects by lowering saturation or lowering vibrance and increasing saturation and things like that. So vibrance is going to be a little bit more, a little bit easier on the image, a little bit more intelligence behind the saturation, and saturation is just going to saturate everything no matter what. So I want to cover the next tab, which is the tone curve. So next to that basic tab, then you can click the tone curve right there. And we see our histogram. And we see a line going from the blacks to the brights. So right now my image is normal. And I actually want to work in, just for demonstration purposes, I'm going to click this point. They're essentially the same thing, but point allows me a little bit more freedom. And I can click and drag up my 1/4 tones. And we can see what's going on here. And this works, and actually Photoshop has an adjustment layer called curves, and it works precisely as this does. So if I brighten those 1/4 tones, we can see that I am brightening the entire image. We can see that this line has gone above what was normal before. I am brightening it, but I'm brightening the highlights more than the shadows. Now I'm going to take a point and drag it down below my original line in the shadows. And we have something that's fairly common in curves, or well, this kind of curves, and that is the S-curve. So what have I done? I brighten my shadows, I darken my darks, I have increased contrast, yeah. Incidentally, contrast has a tendency to also saturate your photos a little bit as well. Just the nature of how it works. I'll go ahead and drag these points off the graph to kind of delete them. Parametric is the same thing, except that it allows me to sort of work in a slightly different way. I only have these 3 points, or 4 points rather, to work with. And I can adjust the curve with a slider bar instead of being able to drop a point wherever I want. So the highlights is going to affect the very, very top. So if I drag this up, it's going to be that very, very top part. And that's that's very, very close to what the whites slider does inside of here. Likewise with the shadows. It's very, very close to what the black slider does. Lights and darks is very, very similar to highlights and shadows, except that highlights and shadows will also affect the highlights and shadows on this version. So it's really just a completely different way of looking at it. It's kind of the same thing, but just a different perspective. Okay, so I don't really want to cover all of these tabs, but feel free to go through them. The FX tab is kind of neat. You can add grain, some vignetting, where you darken or brighten the areas around here. Don't ever go heavy-handed with the vignetting. It's very tempting to do, but don't. Just make it's a very subtle thing. You just barely add a little bit of vignetting. You can make a grayscale image, and there's sepia toning, which is, it calls it split toning. We're going to talk about sharpening and noise reduction next week, so I'll save that tab for next week. Don't worry at all about camera calibration. You can also save, download, and load presets. So, I mean, you might be able to Google presets for Camera Raw and find an Instagram effect or find an HDR kind of effect. So you can save these settings. If you kind of find a neat effect, you can save those settings and then apply them to images later. And then snapshots, I wouldn't worry about too much. It's kind of like presets, but just different. I don't know. Okay, so back to the basic tab, where that it looks kind of like an aperture camera icon. And let's talk about the tools up here at the top of the window. Now, one of the things that Photoshop is really good at is that you can manipulate specific things in an image. For example, I could brighten just this lamp in the middle of the image. I could select it out, and you could brighten just the part of that lamp. So Photoshop is good at doing specific things within a photo. Of course, Photoshop can be used for lots of things, not just photography, but speaking towards that, photography aspect of Photoshop, that's what it's good for. It's good for specifically doing one thing inside of a photo, which is why Camera Raw is really nice, because it's much better at doing things globally, or the entire photo. I can brighten all of my shadows. I can brighten the entire photo. It does, however, have several tools up here in the toolbar that allow us to manipulate specific things, like red eye. There's kind of this weird adjustment brush. There's a gradient thing where you can kind of gradiate the effect. And there's a healing tool for spots and spot removal and things like that. I don't find Camera Raw particularly useful. A lot of these tools are clunky, and I'm not really going to cover them much more than I already have. I strongly prefer to just, if you click Open Image here, it will open inside of Photoshop, and then I will make my changes. Then I will add a slight brightening with curves, and then maybe use a mask and things like that. If I'm in a really big hurry, I'll use these tools, but they're really clunky. They're really clunky. It's hard to see exactly what you're doing. They're all grouped together, incidentally. They're all right here. They're these top four right here. So let's get into some of the other tools. Some of the tools you're already familiar with. The zoom tool, I think you guys know what that one's going to do. The hand tool, that's going to let you move around your photo once you've zoomed in. Oops, how did I do that? The next tool on our list is the white eyedropper tool, or excuse me, white balance tool. This tool I absolutely love. It saves me so much time because white balance in Photoshop is a pain. It's hard to get right. It gives you too much control where I can never quite get it right. But with the eyedropper tool, all I have to do is click on a white, gray, or black point, and I'm done. Sometimes it's hard to find a really good white, gray, or black point. In this photo, I think, let's see, let me grab the zoom tool. I might have some good white points here. I got to be careful because shadow areas can tend to turn a little bit blue. If you zoom in on, it's going to be hard to see on the projector on your screen, but if you zoom in on this, you'll notice that it has a slight blue tint to it. So I might, if I select this, I'm going to grab my eyedropper tool and click here. And I click there, it's going to think that the image is way too blue and then make my image far too yellow to compensate for it. And that's kind of too much, so I'm going to go back here. Maybe choose one of these grays in the building. You kind of click around until you find a really good gray. This tool is going to take a little bit of practice just to sort of find those little nuances like shadows and weird things. Sometimes objects can reflect colors, like you might have a white card or something, or somebody might be holding a white piece of paper, but that piece of paper might be reflecting like a red carpet or something. Like that would be kind of weird. Or that would not give me a good color value. So I'll kind of click up on the top right somewhere and get a color value. You'll notice that it changes the temperature and tint each time I do that. So I do have a little bit of manual control. Now I have a sunset here, and I think that my sunset, now I white balanced it, but it's a little bit too blue, and I think I want to take this up and add a little bit more yellow to my photo to kind of give it that sunset feel. Not too much, but bump it up a little bit. Because I do have a sunset. It should be more of a yellow photograph, at least in this instance. So you do have manual control if the white balance tool doesn't quite give you what you want. The tool next to that is the, what is it called? It lets you drop points on the image. It's not terribly useful. It's a color sampler tool. That's what it is. And I don't really use it. Knowing the RGB values is not usually, really useful. So the tool next to that is the parametric curve tool, and like many of these tools, as you're used to, if you click and hold it, it will give you more options. So just like in Illustrator, when you clicked the rectangle tool, you could click and hold it and there were more tools underneath that one. So the parametric tool is just like that. When you, the actual use of the tool, so let's select regular parametric curve. What it does is it allows me to click and manipulate that part of my image. So when I click in the shadows, it will let me bump the shadows up or down. If I click in my highlights, it lets me bump up and down that part of the image. I can also do this with hue. So I could saturate or desaturate, or I guess I could change my values based on how I drag up like that. I have some purple skies. Saturation, luminance, grayscale mix. is for grayscale images. So that's kind of, actually that's a pretty good tool for grayscaling, but let's turn to grayscale. The next tool on the list is the crop tool. And the really nice thing about the crop tool, so if I crop my image here and I pressed return to commit that crop, I think most of you understand how the crop tool will work. And I press enter to kind of commit to that crop. Well, my original image is still there. I haven't harmed any pixels. So if I crop and I screw up, and that cat in the bottom right got cropped off and it was too cute and I had to bring it back, I still can. There is no cat there. I wish there was. That'd be nice.
I only got how come you got multiple boxes? I only got the one box.
The question was, why do I have multiple boxes? It's showing me an overlay. It's showing me the rule of thirds. If you click and hold, there is an option to show overlay. And it's just a helpful, in the rule of thirds in photography, it's just a nice way to compose photos. It's not actually showing me anything, but just dividing the image into thirds. The tool next to the crop tool is the straighten tool, which allows me to click and drag a line, and then it will automatically crop my image to make it level. So things like the horizon, I'm going to want to click and drag. So if my camera was a little bit tilted to the right or tilted to the left, I would have to use one of these tools. Now this image isn't too bad for that, but things like the tops of buildings, I guess I would never really use this because it's kind of in perspective, but you can see here I clicked and dragged and it automatically straightened the photo based on that line. I probably actually want to use the horizon here. I can't quite see the, oops, grab the tool. Can't quite see the horizon here, but I think the horizon's somewhere right there. And I'll press return to commit my crop, and there I've straightened my image a tiny bit. Other good places to use are people's belt lines. Sometimes you don't always have a good horizon. You can use their belt lines. You can also use their shoulders, unless they're very hunchback or kind of weird. Don't do that. So there are always good lines to kind of straighten your photos by. And the next thing I want to talk to you guys about, almost done, we kind of have this bottom bar. And this bottom bar, where we have our done open image, and you kind of see some random stuff in the middle. Done will save that XMP file, so it saves all those settings. And next time I open it, those settings will be there in place. So if I double click it, everything's back to normal. Be careful about hitting cancel. Also hitting the escape key on your keyboard. Be careful about that, because if you do, it will erase all of the changes that you made to this file. So be careful about the cancel button. Open image will simply open this image with all of the settings applied inside of Photoshop. I'm going to go ahead and click done. I'd like you guys to all do this with me. Go ahead and scroll to the top of the window. And I'm going to hit Command A to select all of my images inside of here. And you'll notice that there's one JPEG, which I used one time for a lecture, but I'm not going to use it this time. And I'm going to Command click it to deselect that one image. So I've got all of my raw files in this folder selected except for that one JPEG. And I'm going to double click any of those photos. And we'll see all of those photos off to the left. So we kind of start to see a workflow going on whenever you have a lot of photos. Now I tend to be a very, what's a good word for it? I shoot a lot. So like a wedding is going to be, an 8-hour event or 48-hour event. And I'm probably going to have somewhere in the range of 2,000 photos. It's a lot. A normal shoot might be 300 photos if it's even just an event. So I have all these photos, and one of the really cool things, and I love this, I utterly love this about Camera Raw and Bridge too is that I can select multiple photos and fix them all together. So if I scroll down to photo 2186, I can kind of see from the thumbnails that it was shot very, very similarly to the 4 or 5 photos beneath it. At least I know that the white balance was the same and things like that. So if I hold down the Shift key and select that row of photos, and I click Auto, which will give me Auto. Of course, it over brightens it a little bit. I can press the I key to bring up my eyedropper tool, and we can white balance all of these photos all together. I think the screen in the back works the best. So white balance. I don't have a good calibration on this monitor, so. And as I adjust my exposure, all of the exposure for all of these photos will change. I think a higher contrast value might work out. Now some of these boxes you'll see don't have any values in them. That's because I clicked Auto and it automatically set all these settings for each individual photo, and these settings are different with each photo, so it doesn't have a value to display. Now one of the things that happens that's rather frustrating with Camera Raw is the fact that once you move any of these sliders, I want to go to the next photo. Well, hotkeys are usually the best way, so I'm going to click the arrow key, but wait, as I click up and down with my arrow keys, or left and right, I'm moving this cursor in the values field. I can't navigate to the next photo. So what you have to do is hold down the Command key and hit left and right arrow, which will allow us to cycle through the photos that we've selected. And we can kind of go back and double check and make sure, hey, maybe some clarity in this photo, or maybe a slightly different white value. Things like that. Or I might go to my parametric curve and apply some settings, right? Oops, too much in the lights. And you don't necessarily have to have multiple photos selected. So you can start to see sort of a workflow. I'm going to look through here, auto these, maybe click one so that I'm only manipulating one at a time here. Adjust these values to then grab my eyedropper tool and white balance. So I'm push the I key for the white balance tool, and then I'll hit Command right. Now it's if you hit left and right and you don't have anything in the cursor window, then it will go to left and right. But it's not a bad idea to just always hold down the Command key. It will still go left and right. It'll save you a little bit of headache when you're trying to do this quickly. I've overexposed this photo, but it's probably not going to give it quite enough. Maybe a little bit less than the highlights. I for my eyedropper. So you can go through these pretty darn quickly. Next. We already did all these, right? We talked about reflective surfaces reflecting. I've got to be careful about picking a fairly reflective surface as my eyedropper. Of course, I'm getting a weird cursor right now, but I have my white balance tool selected. And just Command left and right as I go through. Now, when I'm ready to export these as JPEGs, what I need to do is select one of the photos off to the left and hit Command A to select all. And then I simply click Save Images, which brings up this dialog box. I can select where to save it. I can add some file naming conventions, which I don't know, you don't really need to worry about. And I can save in 4 different formats: DNG, TIFF, and Photoshop, and JPEG. Most of the time, JPEG, right? I can choose the quality and things like that. Now, one thing to be aware of is that this Camera Raw got quite a bit of an upgrade in CC, and there are some other settings to how your photo is saved. So in CS6, those settings are in this blue little bar right here. So things like I can resize my photo. I can click Don't Enlarge, which you should almost always keep that checked. I can change the resolution from 100 pixels per inch to 300 pixels per inch, or 72 pixels per inch. Whatever it is that I need, I can change that. There's a nice quick sharpening for that. Keep in mind that in CS6, these settings will be remembered. I don't know how many times I've exported a whole bunch of photos and I forgot to check these settings in CS6. And it exported my photos out all wrong, and I had to go back and do it again. I'll click let's uncheck resize to fit. Let's just do 300 ppi, and I'll click OK. Now in CC, I'm very happy that they did this, but those settings, as being at the bottom menu bar as well, they are also going to be included at the bottom of this menu. There's actually like kind of an extension, and those settings like resize and sharpening are also located there. Medium is a fine setting. And then you click Save, and you'll notice at the bottom right, it's outputting each image in turn. It's going to take a little while, but not too long. These images, I actually shrank them down a little bit for you guys. And the nice thing is I can click Done and keep working. All of that conversion will happen in the background. Now I chose from that Save menu to save in the same location, so voila, I have lots of JPEGs located in my folder. Of course, this can get a little bit confusing, but the nice thing is I have these filters, so I could just oh, come back. I could sort by all my JPEGs or DNGs. Ah, it's doing some weird things. So I could select all my JPEGs and then save them to a new folder, upload them to Facebook, what have you. Your homework, and I'll go ahead and stop the video.